The scripture reading today is from 1 Samuel, chapter 15, verse 34, including chapter 16, verse 1 through 13, pages 259 and 260 in the Old Testament of your Pew Bible if you want to follow along. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king of Israel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out, and I will send you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice and to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and went to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peaceably?" Samuel replied, "Yes, peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourself and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, Samuel looked at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed one now is before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. But Samuel said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by Samuel, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel questioned Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And Jesse said, "There remains yet the youngest, for he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send him and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes." So he sent for and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and he had beautiful eyes and handsome features. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David, and from that day forward. Samuel then set out for Ramah. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Will you pray with me? O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. And through me or in spite of me, may we who are called to be your people hear the word you long for us to hear. Amen. In order to understand the text that Kathy read for today, we have to have a little history about Samuel. Now, this is the Reader's Digest condensed version. I'm aware that last time I went over by quite a bit of time, so this time we're getting it a little bit, and you can go read all of 1 Samuel to figure out the details. But you need to know a few things. Samuel was a miracle child. His father, Elkanah, had a traditional Hebrew scriptural marriage to 2 women. They were Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah could have kids, Hannah could not. And she was terribly upset. She went to the temple at Shiloh, which, by the way, would be like us going to annual conference to Lakeland this year. And there she prayed, And of course, the priest thought she was drunk, which is what priests usually attribute to people, and clergy sometimes. I'm not picking on the Catholics, but clergy sometimes don't understand when people are deeply in prayer that they haven't had too much of the Methodist punch. So he looks at her, she says, I'm not drunk. I've just been praying. I'm praying fervently for God to give me a son, and if God does, I will dedicate that son to the service of God forever. Good old God. Next year, she has a baby. She nurses him till he can be weaned, and then brings him to the temple in Shiloh and lets Eli, who is the chief priest there, raise this child in the temple. So from the very youngest years, 3, 4 maybe, Samuel is raised in the temple and mentored by Eli. So Eli proclaims that Samuel is going to grow up and be the spiritual leader because he knows his own 2 sons are somewhat corrupt. And he doesn't want them to be taking over moral leadership since their moral compass seems to have gotten stuck on true west instead of true north. Time goes on, and there is a war, and Eli's sons go into battle, and they take the Ark of the Covenant, which is it's like a tent where the scrolls of the scriptures are kept. They take it with them to battle against what Samuel had instructed them to do. Well, that was the wrong thing to do, to take God as if God were on the right side of that particular political persuasion. And it takes the ark into battle. The sons are killed. The Philistines who were fighting them say, this hasn't done us much good. And after a whole outbreak of cancerous tumors, they figure maybe God really was on their side, and they return the ark back to Samuel. So he gets the Ark of the Covenant back, and he is now the resident chief priest. Well, it's been a couple hundred years since the Israelites got from Egypt and made it over to the land of Canaan. And they're saying, wait a minute, folks, we have all these little cities and states, but we have no king over Israel. If we're attacked again, we don't have a united front. We need a king. And Samuel says that a monarchy will exploit the people economically, including outright confiscation of all of their property. But the people don't listen to Samuel. And so Samuel says, okay, what's the least amount of damage I can do? He quietly goes to Saul. Now, this is not the same Saul that becomes Paul. That's, a whole long time in the future. He goes to Saul, who is of the tribe of Benjamin, a little tiny tribe out in the hills by Ramah and Gilead. And he anoints Saul to be king. And thus begins a partnership of many years. It's working pretty well as Samuel, the religious, spiritual leader, the priest, and Saul, the king, the political leader, until such time as a battle is about to begin, and Saul doesn't see where Samuel is, he's not there, and he decides to take upon himself all of the priestly duties, all of the ceremonial religious rituals. By the way, this is the usurping which becomes the divine right of kings. Those of you who have studied history understand what I'm talking about with that. So Samuel comes in the middle of all of this, finds Saul usurping his authority, and this begins the split between the two of them. Well, the next piece that really cemented the split is when Saul leads his people into battle. Samuel has given him the word of the Lord to go up against the Amalekites, kill off their leader Agag, and don't bring anything back with you. But Saul says, well, I will kill off all of the Amalekites, but we can bring Agag back. There's their king, their leader. He's a good military man. I'll bring this general back. He might know more than I know about forging battle. And they have all of these good sheep and all of these good cattle, so we're going to take these as spoils of war, and brings them back. And Samuel is just beside himself because Saul has now ignored the voice of God as it came through Samuel and decided to bring Agag and all of the spoils. So Samuel goes out and draws and quarters Agag. The Bible is much more descriptive than that. And takes all of the meat products and disperses them. And Samuel is so upset with Saul that he takes off for his own country, Ramah. And even though the city of Ramah is not that far from Gibeah, where Saul lives, 2 or 3 miles, they never see each other again in that life. That's pretty upset. So this is where we pick up the text this morning, the last verse of chapter 15. That Samuel left for Ramah, Saul went on to Gibeah, and they never saw each other again in the life, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. And we find Samuel, having spent a good bit of his life in service to Saul, trying to keep the spiritual leadership of this country going, so distraught, so deeply in mourning, so depressed, if you will, that he's not even functioning. He is exhausted from being a prophetic voice, and he's hiding out in his hometown in Ramah. Have any of you ever gotten to that point where you've been so exhausted at your work, trying to be the stabilizing force in your job, and people are just running amok, and you just want to go home and curl up in your bed, pull the blankets over your head, and ignore the world? Anybody ever been there? A couple anyway. Some of you acknowledge it. I have been there, believe me, especially the last 13 weeks with the shingles and so on. I just want to kind of get out of my body, leave it behind, and do something else. God didn't give me that permission. So then God says to Samuel, and here's where we pick up today's story. He said, Sam, come on, wake up, get out of your mourning. Don't you see that Saul was the wrong person and I've turned against him? It's okay. I have more work for you to do. I can just see Samuel going, oh, the last time you called me to go anoint a king, look what happened. You want me to do this again? You've got to be kidding. So he sends him to Bethlehem, to Jesse. The root of Jesse, by the way, is this one. And he goes to Bethlehem, which is also not terribly far from where they're living. And he says, okay, I'll do this. I'll go to Bethlehem, but I'm going to get creamed. If Saul and his minions hear about this, they're going to kill me. God said, don't worry about it. I got you covered. Or I would, as we would say today, got your back. Got it. Just take a heifer, take your stuff, and go and make a sacrifice in their temple. Easy as pie, which is not easy, by the way. Either P-I pie or P-I-E pie. Neither one is easy. So Samuel gets together what the Lord has suggested and takes it with him to Bethlehem. And of course, the people come out and say, have you come in peace? Because they're afraid. And he says, yeah, I've come in peace. I've just come to make a sacrifice. And he summons Jesse to bring his sons with him. Notice the daughters don't get invited, but the sons are invited to come and feast at the sacrifice. And after, they're only going to get to eat. They make their sacrifice to do their prayers, and then they don't get to eat until after Samuel does what the Lord has sent him to do. So he asks Jesse to bring before him all of his sons. He wants to look at them and see which one is the right one. And only Samuel knows that the Lord is going to tell him in his heart. It doesn't come from the rafters, this is God, this is the one. No, it's just in the heart of Samuel. So here, the first one that comes in is the oldest, the heir apparent. He is the one that people really think should be king, Eliab. And there's no spiritual enthusiasm. Not the oldest. Now what? Okay. Next comes Abinadab. He comes in. Still no spiritual enthusiasm. Then comes Shammah. Still no spiritual enthusiasm. That's 3 down. And what Jesse has presented is 4 to go. We know there's actually 5 to go, but 4 to go. Not even naming the last 4 of the sons. The first 3 get named. How'd you like to be the number 4 son and be nameless for history? And he goes through 7. Now, this is kind of like, when I first read this again for this preparation, I had just seen a remake of Cinderella with the musical one, which is kind of fun. But I'm thinking, wow, this sounds like Cinderella. You know, there's all these guys coming in and the glass slipper doesn't fit. God has not directed Samuel in his heart to anoint any of them. And he finally is like, God, this is really getting tiring. I'm exhausted from being a prophet. What next? And he looks at Jesse, and I can only imagine the exasperation in his voice. Is this all you've got? Is this all the sons you have? And Jesse said, well, There's one more, but you really don't want him. He's a ginger. That means a redhead. People, they're red-haired. This is the Middle East, folks. We're talking about dark skin, dark hair. He's a redhead. No, you don't want him. He's out in the fields getting dirty with the sheep. And Samuel said, yeah, I really do want to see him. And in comes the ginger, the outcast. In comes David, little David. And the Lord said to Samuel, this is the one. This is the one. Anoint this one. So in quiet, he pours the oil from the horn, and the picture is there it is, and it's also on the front of your bulletin, pouring the oil of anointing from the horn, and anoints David to be the future king. Now, David doesn't get to rule immediately. There is no peaceful transition of power, okay? He has to kind of bide his time. David goes in and plays music for Saul. He gets to know the court. He gets to know, the people in the court. But it takes a while before David gets to be king. But he knows that he is chosen by God. And after that time, Samuel, now a very old dude, gray-haired, gray-bearded, limping, tired, bent over, goes back to Ramah. And we only see him 2 more times in 1 Samuel. Go and look up who wrote 2 Samuel and what that one's about. Because 1 Samuel ends with Samuel at chapter 25. 2 more times. We see David going up to him for advice, and we see when Samuel dies, chapter 25. That's all. So Samuel is out of the picture. But we have a lot to learn from this text. First is that Samuel lived a long life of service. Many of you here have lived a long life of service, both to your church and to your community, to your occupation, to your home. You've lived a long life of service, and sometimes you can get a little bit exhausted from doing that. So the next question is, do we let go when God changes our path? Let go and let God. Samuel was tired. He was an exhausted prophet and priest. And God, history's repeating itself. You want me to go and make a king again. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Even here, he goes. Do we get discouraged and exhausted? Now, if we say, no, we've never been discouraged or exhausted in our work life or in our Christian life of service, especially in our Christian life of service, if we've never gotten exhausted, then we probably haven't gone deep enough into our faith. We're living a superficial faith, because when you do missions, when you're caring for people that in homeless shelters, when you're taking care of children who have special needs and family situations that don't look like they're going to change, when you do those things, it gets really tiring. Howie can tell us about what it's like to be at Habitat. And Sarah and I have done that a couple of times. And just before the surgery and the shingles, we did some hammering for 4 hours. And let me tell you, twisted to the side hammering, when I don't do that all the time, was really exhausting. And that was part of my Christian service. And it was tiring, I'll admit it. Do we have our prophetic and priestly life on a pedestal saying it's going to be easy, we don't have to worry about it? Or do we realize that when we accept the call to be a Christian, it's going to be a difficult challenge? It gets progressively harder. God entices us by giving us little snippets first. And the deeper we go, the harder it gets. Hope you're talking about that in your Sunday school classes. That being a prophetic or a priestly presence is not a top 10 rated job. It's not cushy. You're not going to see it on Indeed or on any of the job sites. Just being a prophet or priest is not there, because nobody's going to take the job. Do we give up just before God's plan is revealed? Boy, it would have been easy for Samuel on number 7 son to say, that's it. I must have misunderstood God. But there was one more, and that was the one. So often, we are this close to God's plan being revealed in us when we decide we're not going any further. One more step, and God's plan is going to be fulfilled. Do we rationalize that the one whom God chooses doesn't look like us, our clan, our community, our church? David did not look like any other Israelite. And Sarah and I talk a lot about this because one of her second cousins is a ginger. He's a redhead. And he finds there's such prejudice in the United States, even against ginger people. But can you imagine being in the Middle East and being a ginger? That would be a lot worse. And the people would say, can't be him. He doesn't look like us. He certainly doesn't smell like us. He's been out with the sheep. He hasn't been in the manor house. By the way, Jesse was pretty well off. He owned all of those sheep, and he owned those fields, and he owned a house big enough to house 7 or 8 sons and an assembly of daughters that aren't listed for us. He owned a lot of property, but David was the one who was out in the field smelling like sheep. Doesn't smell like us, doesn't look like us, doesn't behave like us, sits around playing a little harp all day, strumming music and going, oh, Lord, you're so great to me. You know, the other boys aren't doing that. David is different. So sometimes God chooses the strange ones to be the leaders, and we don't even look at it that way. We don't realize it. And finally, even when we're tired, exhausted, done with what we think is done with our prophetic process, are we willing to let God energize us one more time? One more time to change the course of history. Samuel found David, and most of you know what happens with David later on. He becomes king and is of the lineage of Jesus. Pretty important stuff that if Samuel had given up, things might not have gone the same way. When we are reaching rock bottom, and friends, I got to tell you, the last 13 weeks with the shingles pain that I've endured, by the way, if you haven't gotten the new shots, the 2 series, please, please, please go get it. It'll stop you from having shingles, and you never, ever want to go through the pain that I've endured. But in these 13 weeks of pain, there were times that I wanted to just give up. I wanted to say, I'm not going to do anything more. I'm going to lay around on the couch. I'm not going anywhere. God kept saying, get up, walk. Yeah, you're going to hurt. So what? Get on with it. Move it. Because I can't heal you unless you do. And doctor-type people know that particularly even in pets, unless you get them moving, if they lay around and they're confined to a cage, they're not going to heal. They've got to get up and move. Same as with we humans. So when we are feeling at our lowest ebb is the easiest time to give it all to God, to surrender everything, because God can use us best when we're not holding on to even a little iota of our own control. Are you an exhausted prophet? Thanks be to God. Amen.